Welcome, everyone, for this deep dive. We're getting into Easter.
hmm
You sent in a really fascinating mix of sources, some broad overviews, others digging into specific customs, and let's face it, the often slightly confusing question of how the date actually gets decided.
It can be confusing, yeah.
So our mission today is basically to unpack all of that, aiming for a clear and hopefully engaging look at this really central Christian festival.
Sounds good. Easter or Pascha or Resurrection Sunday,
Yeah.
it really is fundamental to Christian belief, isn't it? It marks the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Absolutely.
And the sources you've gathered, they do a great job highlighting all the layers,
Mm.
the history, the theology, and all the, well, vibrant traditions that have kind of grown up around it over centuries.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. The name itself, Easter. It's kind of interesting, isn't it, that the English term might link back to pre-Christian stuff.
It really is.
Yeah.
Our sources point towards the Anglo-Saxon goddess Ostri. According to Bede, anyway.
Bede, right. Her month, Ostermunal, which is roughly our April, was apparently a time for feasts in her honor.
Exactly. But then you contrast that with Pascha.
Yeah, Pascha,
Yeah.
which has roots in, what, Aramaic, Greek, Latin.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the very direct Resurrection Sunday. But that link between Pascha and the Jewish Passover, Pesach, that's really key.
It is, and it's fascinating how that language connection mirrors something deeper, historically.
Totally. Because in a lot of European languages, they actually use the same or a very similar word for both Christian Easter and Jewish Passover.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and even older English Bibles, sometimes they used the word Easter when they were actually talking about Passover. It just shows how, well, intertwined they were early on.
Absolutely. And shifting to the core meaning,
Yeah,
the theological heart is, well, obviously the resurrection of Jesus.
undeniably. It's foundational for Christianity.
Paul writes about this victory over death, doesn't he? And Peter talks about a new birth into a living hope through the resurrection.
Exactly. And for believers, this isn't just something that happened way back when. It's about a present spiritual reality and also that future hope, physical resurrection, eternal life.
So connecting that, Easter is deeply tied into the Passover and Exodus story.
Profoundly linked, yes. The Gospels themselves place Jesus' Last Supper, his suffering, his crucifixion, all right there during Passover week.
And Jesus actually reinterprets the Passover meal, right? Identifying the bread and wine.
With his body and blood, a hugely significant moment,
It really is. Paul even calls Christ our Passover lamb who's been sacrificed.
which connects directly back to that Jewish tradition of removing leaven, the chametz, before Passover. So yeah, from the very beginning, theologically, you see this deep, deep connection.
So how did the early Christians actually, mark this? How did they celebrate?
Well, given that the crucifixion and resurrection happened during Passover week, it just makes sense that the earliest Christians would time their own annual remembrance around it.
Okay. And we start seeing solid evidence for a distinct Christian festival, Pascha or Easter, by when? Mid-second century.
Yeah, around the mid-100s, there's a Paschal homily attributed to Melito of Sardis from about that time, and it suggests Easter was already, pretty well established.
Which is interesting because that's about the same time we see evidence for commemorating martyrs, but those were usually on fixed dates, right? Like the anniversary of their death.
Exactly. Those were fixed solar dates, but Easter's timing was tied to the Jewish lunisolar calendar.
And relying on the Jewish calendar while showing its origins didn't always go smoothly, did it? Led to some debates.
Oh, definitely. Some quite significant early church debates, actually, which gets us into the drama surrounding the date.
The date drama, yes. First up, the Quartodeciman controversy. Sounds technical.
A bit, but it just refers to Christians, mainly in the Roman province of Asia, modern-day Turkey, roughly who kept the practice of ending their Lenten fast on the 14th day of Nisan in the Hebrew calendar.
So on Passover itself.
Essentially, yes. They called it the Lord's Passover. And a big figure here was Polycarp of Smyrna, believed to be a disciple of the Apostle John. He actually went to Rome to discuss this very issue with Bishop Anicetus.
And how did that go?
Well, they couldn't agree on the practice, but remarkably, they agreed to disagree peacefully. They didn't break communion, which really says something about trying to maintain unity back then.
That is impressive. But the issue didn't just go away.
No, it flared up again about a generation later. Victor, who was Bishop of Rome then, took a much harder line. He actually tried to excommunicate Polycrates of Ephesus and, well, all the other bishops in Asia who held to that 14th day practice.
Wow, excommunication. So what happened?
Well, several church councils or synods were held, and it seems most of them supported observing Easter on a Sunday, which was the practice favored by Rome and also Alexandria.
But Polycrisi pushed back.
He did. He really emphasized the ancient roots of their tradition in Asia. Thankfully, other bishops like Irenaeus stepped in and urged tolerance, reminding Victor of how Anicetus had handled it before.
So the excommunication was called off.
Ultimately, yes.
Yeah.
But it shows the tension. And it seems this quarto-deciman practice actually lingered in some places into the 4th century.
Mm.
It wasn't just about a date, was it? It was about authority, tradition, unity.
Yeah, defining the church while respecting different customs, a familiar tension, maybe?
Absolutely. And even just the reliance on the Jewish calendar started causing unease for some Christians by the later 3rd century.
Right. Because they didn't like depending on the Jewish community to figure out when Nisan, and therefore Passover, would fall.
Exactly. And the main worry was that sometimes Jewish communities might set Passover before the spring equinox.
Ah, the equinox issue.
Yeah. There's evidence for this concern, like the Sardica Paschal table, which shows Nisan 14 sometimes falling quite early.
So because of that dissatisfaction, some Christians started trying to figure out the date independently.
They did. They started experimenting with their own calculations. Others, though, felt it was important to keep consulting with Jewish communities, even if the dates seemed a bit off sometimes. It was a period of, well, flux, setting the stage for a more standardized approach.
Which brings us neatly to a really key moment. The First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
A huge one. Convened by Emperor Constantine, partly, it seems, to sort out this very issue of when to celebrate Easter, especially addressing that quarto-deciman controversy.
Okay, so what did Nicaea actually decide about the date? The official records are a bit sparse on this specific point, aren't they?
They are. The surviving canons don't explicitly lay out the dating rules,
Yeah.
but accounts from people who were at the council, like Constantine himself in letters, they mentioned a clear decision. Quarto-decimanism was out.
Right. No more following the 14th of Nisan strictly.
No. The general agreement was that all Christians should celebrate on the same day, determined independently from the Jewish calendar and aligning with the practice of Rome and, significantly, Alexandria.
Why Alexandria specifically?
Because Alexandria had a really strong reputation for astronomical calculations. They were seen as the experts in this kind of thing.
And this is where we get the rule we basically still use today, right? The first Sunday after the first full moon, on or after the vernal equinox.
That's the core principle that emerges. Now, the sources note that the later tradition attributing the specific use of the 19-year Metonic cycle directly to Nicaea is probably not accurate based on recent scholarship.
Ah, the Metonic cycle, that's about how lunar and solar years nearly match up over 19 years. Makes calculating tricky.
Very tricky. But while the specific cycle might not have been mandated at Nicaea, the council almost certainly endorsed the principle of using the vernal equinox as the starting point, especially since Alexandria was already doing that.
Okay. So Nicaea sets this standard, but you mentioned earlier the old way, the proto-Paschal custom of using the Jewish calendar, it didn't just disappear overnight.
Not at all. You still see church rulings and sermons condemning it later on, which tells you it was still being practiced by some. But gradually, the calculation system developed in Alexandria, gained ground, and eventually became the standard across most of Christianity.
But it wasn't like a sudden switch everywhere, was it? It took time for everyone to get on board.
Definitely not sudden. Rome, for example, had its own methods for a while. They used an older 8-year cycle, then an 84-year cycle developed by someone called Augustulus.
An 84-year cycle, wow.
Yeah, before they eventually adopted a version of the Alexandrian system, adapted by Victorius of Aquitaine. It sounds like a real mathematical journey.
It does. So these different calculations meant Easter could still vary between regions for a while.
For a time, yes, slight variations could occur. But the Alexandrian rules, promoted heavily by the influential Easter tables created by Dionysius Exiguus around 525, became dominant in the West.
What about places like Britain and Ireland?
They also initially used an 84-year cycle. And interestingly, they fixed their equinox on March 25th, not the 21st. But they eventually adopted the Alexandrian method too, mostly during the 7th and 8th centuries after debates like the Synod of Whitby.
And then the rest of Western Europe.
Pretty much unified under the Alexandrian system during Charlemagne's reign, late 8th century. So for a good chunk of the Middle Ages, there was relative uniformity in the West regarding the date.
Relative uniformity until the calendar itself changed.
Exactly. The big split we see today really solidifies in 1582 when the Catholic Church adopted the Gregorian calendar, reforming the Julian calendar.
But the Eastern churches didn't adopt it.
Most Eastern Orthodox churches continued, and still continue, to use the older Julian calendar for calculating feast days like Easter, and that's the root of the divergence we see now.
Okay, so let's break down that rule again. Bede stated it pretty concisely back in 725. The Sunday following the full moon, which falls on or after the equinox. Sounds simple, but the devil's in the details, right?
Very much so. That full moon, the Paschal full moon, isn't necessarily the exact astronomical full moon you might see in the sky.
Okay, how's it different?
It's an ecclesiastical full moon, specifically the 14th day of a lunar month, determined by church tables and calculations, not direct observation. And the equinox is also fixed for calculation purposes.
Fixed on March 21st.
Yes, the ecclesiastical vernal equinox is always March 21st, even though the actual astronomical equinox can shift a day or so.
And the lunar tables used in the Julian and Gregorian calendars have also drifted apart over time.
They have. Because the Julian calendar is slightly less accurate regarding the solar year, its associated lunar calculations are now about 5 days behind the Gregorian ones. So you've got differences in the base solar calendar and in the lunar calculations.
Which inevitably leads to different dates for Easter.
Precisely. The modern computation, it's based on these complex lunisolar cycles. You have lunar months alternating 29 and 30 days, and you periodically add an extra month to keep roughly aligned with the solar year.
And the Paschal lunar month is the key one.
Right. It's defined as the lunar month whose first day, the ecclesiastical new moon, falls between March 8th and April 5th, inclusive.
And Easter is then the Sunday after the 14th day of that specific month.
Exactly. That 14th day is designated the Paschal full moon. And this whole system ensures the Paschal full moon falls between March 22nd and April 18th.
Okay. And the Gregorian calculation, the one most Western churches use, that's based on work by Aloysius Lilius.
Yes, his method was adopted with the Gregorian calendar reform. And places like the British Empire officially switched over with the Calendar Act of 1750, aligning their Easter calculations.
So the bottom line is, Western Easter, using the Gregorian system, always falls between March 22nd and April 25th.
That's the range, which is why in many Western countries, Good Friday and sometimes Easter Monday are public holidays tied to this period.
And for Eastern Orthodox churches, they stick to the same rule but apply it to the Julian calendar.
Correct. First Sunday after the first full moon, on or after their March 21st equinox. But because the Julian March 21st currently corresponds to April 3rd in the Gregorian calendar, and their lunar calculations differ.
Their Easter date ends up being different, often later.
Yes. Orthodox Easter typically falls between April 4th and May 8th on the Gregorian calendar we use day to day. Sometimes it coincides with the Western date, but often it's a week or even 4 or 5 weeks later.
Although you mentioned some interesting exceptions, like on the Greek island of Syros.
Yeah, where the Catholic minority often celebrates with the Orthodox majority to maintain community harmony. It shows how practical considerations can sometimes, influence things.
And Orthodox Christians in Finland use the Western date.
They do, yes. An interesting case agreed upon for national unity reasons.
So this ongoing difference, it's naturally led to calls for reform, trying to find one single date.
Absolutely. There have been quite a few proposals over the last century or so.
Like fixing it to a specific Sunday in Emerald, the Sunday after the second Saturday.
That's been a popular suggestion. It offers predictability. But despite some support, including from business communities, it's never been universally adopted by the churches. Lack of consensus, really.
And there was an Orthodox Congress back in 1923.
In Constantinople, yes. They actually agreed to adopt a revised Julian calendar, which is astronomically more accurate than the Gregorian for the solar year. And the initial plan did include calculating Easter based on astronomical observations at the Jerusalem meridian.
But that part never happened for Easter itself.
No. While some Orthodox churches use the revised Julian calendar for fixed feasts like Christmas, none use the Jerusalem meridian rule for Easter. They either stick to the old Julian calculation or, like Finland, use the Gregorian one.
And the UK even passed a law, the Easter Act 1928.
They did. It allows Easter to be fixed as the first Sunday after the second Saturday in April. But it's never been implemented. It just sits there waiting for agreement among the churches.
Still on the books. And the World Council of Churches tried again more recently.
In 1997, yeah. They proposed a method using modern astronomical calculations for the equinox and full moon, specifically centered on Jerusalem, aiming to bridge the Julian and Gregorian differences. But again, it wasn't adopted.
But the conversation is still alive. There was talk in 2016 and even more recently.
Yes, Sources mention renewed discussions, and in 2022, the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople apparently expressed hope for finding a common date by 2025.
2025, that would be the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea.
Exactly. Achieving a common date by then would be hugely symbolic, a powerful sign of unity.
It really would. Looking at a table of dates, like the one provided in the sources for 2015, 2030, you really see the difference starkly. Sometimes they align, often they're weeks apart.
It clearly illustrates the practical outcome of these different calendar systems.
Okay, so that's the complex story of the date. Let's shift gears now to where Easter fits in the wider church year. For Western Christianity, it's the absolute high point after a long period of preparation, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's preceded by Lent, that 40-day period, not counting Sundays, usually of fasting, prayer, reflection, starting on Ash Wednesday.
And the week just before Easter is Holy Week.
Right. Kicking off with Palm Sunday, remembering Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, then Spy Wednesday, focusing on Judas' betrayal, and leading into the most solemn part, the Easter Triduum.
Triduum, the 3 days, Maundy Thursday.
Commemorating the Last Supper and the washing of the disciples' feet.
Good Friday.
Remembering the crucifixion and death of Jesus. A day of somber reflection.
And Holy Saturday.
The day Jesus lay in the tomb, a day of waiting, often culminating in the Easter Vigil service that night.
And then comes Easter Sunday, the celebration itself. But it doesn't just end there, does it?
Not at all. The celebration continues through Easter week, sometimes called the Octave of Easter, and the whole Easter season, or Eastertide, Paschaltide, lasts for 50 days, 7 weeks, right up until Pentecost Sunday.
50 days of Eastertide. And for Eastern Christianity, a similar pattern of preparation and extended celebration.
Very similar structure, yes.
Yeah.
They have Great Lent, also 40 days, but starting on Clean Monday, it builds towards Lazarus Saturday and Palm Sunday, followed by their Holy Week.
And their Easter celebration begins with the Paschal Vigil, too.
Yes, typically starting late Saturday night and leading into Easter Sunday morning. The week after Easter is called Bright Week, a period of intense joy where fasting rules are completely suspended.
And their whole season runs until Pentecost as well.
Yes, the period from Easter, or Pascha, through to Pentecost is called the Pentecostarian. It concludes on the Sunday of All Saints, which is the Sunday after Pentecost. So again, a 50-day focus on the resurrection and its aftermath.
So while the calendars might differ, the rhythm of preparation, intense celebration, and an extended season of joy is common.
Very much so. The focus on Christ's sacrifice, followed by the overwhelming joy and hope of the resurrection, is universal across these traditions.
Let's talk about the services themselves. In the West, that Easter Vigil on Holy Saturday night is pretty significant.
It really is. Often considered the liturgical high point of the year. Rich symbolism, darkness to light, lighting the Paschal candle, scripture readings, tracing salvation history, baptism sometimes. It's powerful.
And then Easter Sunday services, maybe sunrise services in some traditions?
Yes, sunrise services are quite popular, especially in Methodist and Moravian traditions, symbolizing the dawning of resurrection hope. And throughout the season, you have that joyful Paschal greeting.
Ah, yes. Christ is risen.
And the response, "He is risen indeed. Alleluia," a core expression of Easter faith.
And in the East, the main service starts late Saturday.
Typically, yes. The church is dark. Then around midnight, the priest lights a candle from the altar, representing the light of Christ, and shares it with the congregation. Then there's usually a procession around the church.
Followed by services and then a big feast.
Exactly. After the long Lenten fast, the feast following the Easter service is a huge celebration, breaking the fast with foods that were forbidden during Lent. It's a very communal, joyous time.
Now, it's worth noting, not all Christian groups actually observe Easter in these traditional ways, or even at all.
That's true. The sources mention several groups with different perspectives. For instance, some Puritans historically rejected Easter, seeing it, along with Christmas, as lacking a direct command in the Bible, and possibly having non-Christian roots.
And some modern conservative Reformed groups follow that line, based on the regulative principle of worship.
Right. The idea that corporate worship should only include elements explicitly commanded or warranted in Scripture. Since Easter isn't mandated in the same way Sunday worship is, they don't observe it as a special holy day.
And others, like the Restored Church of God, specifically object to perceived pagan origins.
Yes, they often argue it's derived from ancient spring fertility festivals and shouldn't be mixed with Christian practice.
Jehovah's Witnesses have a different focus, too, don't they?
They commemorate the Last Supper, which they call the memorial of Christ's death, annually on the date corresponding to Nisan 14. Their focus is on the death and its ransom significance, not specifically a resurrection festival.
And Quakers.
Historically, Quakers rejected set times and seasons for worship as part of their testimony, believing every day should be lived in devotion to God. So no special observance of Easter or other church holidays. It highlights the diversity within Christianity on these matters. It certainly does. A real spectrum of practice and belief regarding holy days.
But for the vast majority of Christians globally, Easter remains the central feast, a huge time of celebration after the solemnity of Lent.
Absolutely. And you see so many wonderful traditions that have sprung up around it, shared across cultures.
Like sunrise services, the Paschal greeting we mentioned, flowering the cross.
Yes, decorating a bare cross with flowers on Easter Sunday, symbolizing the transition from death to life. Very visual.
Easter bonnets, clipping the church. That's an interesting one.
Yeah, clipping the church involves the congregation joining hands and encircling the church building, often while singing or praying. A tradition found in some parts of England, symbolizing unity and surrounding the church with love.
And of course, Easter eggs. We'll get more into those, but decorating them, breaking them.
Hugely symbolic of the empty tomb and new life. And the Easter lily, too, has become a very common symbol of resurrection, especially in Western churches.
And then there are the more, let's say, secular or cultural customs that have attached themselves. Easter parades.
Yes, big parades in some cities like New York, communal dancing in parts of Eastern Europe. And then there's the Easter Bunny.
Ah, the bunny. And egg hunts. Can't forget the egg hunts.
Definitely not. It's also become, let's be honest, a major commercial event. Cards, candy, especially chocolate eggs. Big business.
Given all the significance, it's no surprise Easter is a public holiday in many places.
For sure. Countries with large Christian populations often recognize it, frequently including Good Friday and our Easter Monday as well.
The sources mention Nordic countries having quite long Easter breaks.
Yes, traditionally quite expensive holidays there. Italy marks both Easter Sunday, Pasqua, and Monday, Paschetta, as national holidays.
And Greece has Easter bonuses for some workers.
Apparently, yes, for public sector employees. Reflects its importance in Greek culture.
Commonwealth countries vary, but often Good Friday or Easter Monday or both are holidays.
That's typical. And in the U.S., while Easter Sunday itself isn't a federal holiday because it always falls on a Sunday, many businesses might close, and Good Friday is observed as a holiday by some states and the stock market. Plus, you still have those big cultural events like parades.
Okay, let's talk food. Because Easter seems to come with a lot of specific food traditions.
Oh, absolutely. And many carry symbolic weight. Lamb is probably the most common thread globally.
Connecting back to the Passover lamb.
Exactly. The Paschal lamb, representing Jesus as the sacrifice. So roast lamb is a very traditional Easter Sunday meal in many cultures.
And hot cross buns, a Good Friday staple in many places.
Yes. The cross on top, obviously symbolizing the crucifixion. The spices are sometimes said to represent the spices used to embalm Jesus' body.
And maybe orange peel for the bitterness of his suffering. I read that somewhere.
That's sometimes mentioned, yeah. There's even a story tracing them back to a 14th century monk in St. Albans, England, who gave out similar spiced buns, Alban buns, to the poor on Good Friday. Whether that's the direct origin, who knows, but it's a nice story.
It is, and then there are so many regional specialties.
A huge variety. Sweden and Denmark might have a festive smorgasbord. Finland has roast lamb, but also memi, a traditional rye porridge dessert, and maybe pascha, a creamy dessert.
Greece has margaritsa, that specific soup made after midnight mass, and the famous red-dyed eggs.
Yes, the red symbolizing the blood of Christ. Italy has lamb dishes like abbacchio, but also the dove-shaped colomba di Pasqua cake.
Mexico has capirotada, a bread pudding with symbolic ingredients representing the Passion. Spain has the mona de Pascua cake, often decorated with eggs.
And in Eastern Orthodox countries, Russia, Poland, Finland too, you find pascha, that rich, sweet, cheese-based pyramid dessert, often decorated with XB for Christ is risen, and special Easter breads like kulish in Russia or pascha in Ukraine and Poland. Many of these use ingredients like eggs and dairy that were abstained from during Lent.
So the feast really is a feast. Okay, on to Easter eggs themselves, such a dominant symbol.
Absolutely. The egg is an ancient symbol of new life, rebirth, fertility, long predating Christianity.
But Christians adopted it.
They did, connecting it specifically to Jesus' resurrection and the empty tomb, like rolling away the stone from the tomb.
And the red eggs in the Orthodox tradition go way back.
Yeah, there's a tradition associating Mary Magdalene with presenting a red egg to Emperor Tiberius. But generally, early Christians in Mesopotamia were apparently staining eggs red in memory of Christ's blood. It's a very old custom.
And the blessing of eggs in the Orthodox Church is still a big thing.
Very much so. And intricately decorated eggs, like the Ukrainian pazanki, are incredible folk art forms full of symbolism.
We have to mention Fabergé eggs too, though maybe not typical folk art.
Huh? No. Those were luxurious, unique creations for the Russian czars. Masterpieces of jewelry art, but drawing on that Easter egg tradition.
And today, chocolate eggs everywhere.
Yes. Chocolate eggs, plastic eggs filled with candy, often given as gifts, maybe symbolizing the end of Lenten self-denial for some.
Egg hunts are massive too. Cadbury sponsors huge ones in the UK, you mentioned.
They do. And the White House Easter egg roll is a really long-standing American tradition dating back to the 19th century.
So from ancient symbol to chocolate frenzy. And that leaves us with the Easter Bunny.
The Easter Bunny, a rather charming, if slightly mysterious figure.
Where did that come from? Germany seems to be the origin.
Yes, the earliest mentions seem to be among German Lutherans, where the Easter hare, or Entrehaus, judged whether children were good or bad and brought colored eggs on Easter morning. German immigrants took the tradition to America.
Sort of like a springtime Santa Claus.
A bit, yeah. The idea is kids make nests or leave out baskets, and the Easter Bunny fills them with eggs and treats if they've been well behaved.
And it wasn't always a hare or rabbit. Sources mentioned foxes, storks.
Apparently, in some regions of Germany, other creatures were sometimes credited. But the hare, possibly linked to ancient associations with spring and fertility, though the bead connection to Easter via hares is debated, became the dominant figure.
And in Australia, they promote the Easter bilby.
Yes, as a native alternative, because rabbits are invasive pests there. A nice conservation-linked adaptation.
Well, wow, we have covered a lot of ground here, haven't we?
We certainly have, from ancient origins and deep theology to calendars and bunnies.
We've really traced this rich history, those early links to Passover, maybe even pre-Christian echoes, right through to today's global celebrations in all their variety.
Explored the absolute core of it, the resurrection faith, and then that long, sometimes quite contentious journey just to agree on when to celebrate it.
Yeah, the dating saga is a story in itself, and then all the diverse traditions, the symbols, eggs, lilies, lamb, buns that have evolved and attached themselves to this pivotal festival.
It's a remarkable tapestry, really. Shows the enduring power of the core event and how it shaped faith and culture for, well, 2 millennia.
So as we wrap up, maybe something for you, our listeners, to think about, considering all those historical debates about the date, the ongoing discussions even now, and just the sheer variety of ways Easter is marked, it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Number what?
Well, what does that flexibility or sometimes that perceived fixedness of these really deep-rooted traditions actually mean for how we understand faith or even cultural identity today?
That's a great question. That interplay between tradition, history, and how we live now.
Exactly. Something to chew on. Thanks, everyone, for taking this deep dive with us into the world of Easter.